The cold wind swept across the plain, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a river swelled, its waters rising faster than any man could remember. Soldiers on the front lines stared at the horizon, knowing that the enemy was advancing, and yet a different, silent threat moved even faster, the floodwaters, creeping steadily toward the villages, the roads, the very trenches they called home. They said survival was impossible. No map could chart the waters, no orders could slow them, and yet in the chaos of war, a few men would stand against the tide. It was the late autumn of 1941. The Eastern Front had already become a nightmare of mud, steel, and fire. German forces, confident and ruthless, pushed relentlessly across the Soviet landscape. Cities fell, railways were destroyed, and villages were left in smoldering ruin. But the war was not fought only between men and guns. The land itself was a weapon, a barrier, a threat, and on some days it seemed as though nature had chosen a side. Rivers that had long been calm, sources of life for centuries, suddenly became agents of terror. Dams cracked, spillways overflowed, and entire valleys disappeared under sheets of icy water. The soldiers who first noticed the rising waters were engineers and sappers, men whose daily work had always been to control and redirect the forces of the natural world. They had built bridges and bunkers, dug trenches, and laid the foundations of defenses meant to hold back the enemy. But this flood was not something they could calculate easily. It was unpredictable, violent, and unstoppable by conventional means. They watched as their careful measurements failed, as the river consumed the banks and ran wild through the villages. Yet, even as despair threatened to overwhelm them, there was movement. Orders came down through the chain of command, terse and urgent: hold the line, not just against the enemy, but against the waters themselves. Soldiers were called to act in ways no training had ever prepared them for. They filled sandbags, reinforced levees, and waded into freezing currents. Each man knew the cost, the risk of hypothermia, the sudden collapse of earth, the crushing force of water, and yet they went forward, because retreat was not an option, and because somewhere in their hearts they understood that courage was measured not only by bullets and bombs, but by endurance and ingenuity in the face of nature itself. In the small villages along the river, civilians huddled in attics and cellars. Mothers pressed children to their chests, whispering promises of survival they could not be certain of. Farmers clutched their tools, abandoned fields now little more than shallow lakes. And above it all, the soldiers worked tirelessly, forming human chains, passing sandbags hand to hand, racing against the relentless current. The roar of the water was deafening. The mud sucked at boots, rendering every movement a battle in itself. Smoke from nearby skirmishes hung low in the sky, mixing with the cold mist rising from the river, create a haze that made time feel suspended, as though the world itself had paused to watch who would survive. Among the ranks, whispers spread of impossible feats. Men who had been declared lost in other battles reappeared here, drenched and exhausted, yet determined to fight a different kind of enemy. Small victories, almost invisible, marked each hour. A levee held for 10 minutes longer, a trench remained passable, a family rescued from the brink. The soldiers did not speak of heroism, they spoke of necessity. Their actions were dictated by a logic that only those who had stared into the abyss could understand: move, reinforce, survive. One misstep could mean not just their deaths, but the collapse of entire defensive lines, allowing both the flood and the enemy to sweep through the land unopposed. And yet, even amidst this desperate struggle, there were moments of stark clarity. A soldier paused to watch the water swirl around a half-submerged horse, understanding it. That instant, the fragile balance between life and the forces that sought to destroy it. Another soldier, shivering to the bone, saw a child's hand reach from the water, and he knew that survival meant more than holding a line on a map. It meant holding onto humanity itself. These were the moments that would later be recounted in hushed tones, in letters home, in diary, kept hidden in coat pockets, evidence of courage that no medal could ever fully honor. As night fell, the floodwaters rose higher, cloaking the world in darkness. Lanterns swung in the wind, and the rhythmic sound of splashing feet and shouted orders became a strange kind of music, a desperate hymn of defiance against a world gone mad. Somewhere upstream, a dam threatened to give way. The engineers, faces streaked with mud and sweat, calculated, shouted, and reinforced. Each plank, each sandbag, each handhold mattered. In the distance, the enemy advanced, but for this night, the immediate threat was the water, and the men knew that the fate of hundreds, perhaps thousands, rested on their shoulders. No one spoke of glory. There were no parades, no cheering crowds. Only the cold, the wet, the fear, and the relentless drive to survive. And in that darkness, a quiet truth emerged. Sometimes the greatest victories of war are measured not in territory gained, but in lives held back from the tide. The soldiers did not know if they could hold the line until dawn. They only knew that they must try, because the alternative, surrendering to the flood, surrendering to fate, was unthinkable. By the first light of morning, a fragile calm settled over the flooded fields. The water had receded slightly, held in check by the sweat, blood, and sheer determination of those who had refused to give in. Soldiers leaned on shovels and sandbags, faces exhausted, bodies trembling, but eyes still burning with resolve. They had survived a night that no one had believed survivable. And yet, as the fog lifted, they knew this was only the beginning. The enemy was still out there. The river would rise again, and somewhere in the heart of every man who had faced the waters a question lingered. How long could they hold back the flood before it claimed them all? The answer, as it would turn out, would define not just the outcome of a battle, but the endurance of the human spirit itself. Dawn barely cut through the mist, and yet the men were already moving. Their boots squelched in the thick mud, each step a negotiation with gravity and the stubborn pull of icy water. The flood had not been fully tamed, it had merely been stalled. Every levee, every barricade, every hastily reinforced embankment was a fragile promise. A promise that could shatter in seconds under the weight of both water and war. Orders crackled over field radios, barked through messengers scribbled on soaked notebooks: hold the river, protect the villages, delay the enemy. And all the while the river pressed forward, unconcerned with human will. Engineers scurried from point to point, their hands raw from rope burns and splintered wood. They had learned quickly that brute force was not enough. The water had to be coaxed, guided, restrained with subtlety and calculation. Channels were dug, trenches reinforced, dikes patched with whatever material could be found. Sandbags, broken planks, even frozen earth pressed by human hands. Each effort was a gamble, one misjudged angle, one miscalculated current, and an entire village could vanish beneath the waves. Reports later described the scene as organized chaos, a term that barely conveyed the terror and ingenuity required. The soldiers themselves were a mixture of seasoned veterans and terrified conscripts, thrown together in a fight unlike any they had trained for. Riflemen watched the horizon for enemy movement while simultaneously monitoring the rising water. Artillery crews repositioned their guns not only for defensive fire but to shore up weak points in embankments. Even supply convoys risked crossing partially submerged roads, balancing trucks on the edge of collapse while carrying timber, sandbags, and food for the men and civilians alike. Every second was a test of nerves and coordination, every breath an exercise in patience and hope. Amid this struggle, stories of small heroism began to emerge. A lieutenant reportedly saved a squad by wading into chest-deep water, forming a human chain to guide them to a safer trench. A pair of engineers held a collapsing dike, with nothing but shovels and sheer determination until reinforcements arrived. Memoirs from the time recall the exhaustion. My hands were raw, my lungs burned. And yet, the river waited for no man. These were not stories of victory over an enemy army, but of survival against an indifferent and relentless force of nature, a force no map or strategy could contain. The enemy, too, was aware of the flood. German reconnaissance planes had flown over the rivers, noting swollen banks and submerged roads. Commanders puzzled over the difficulty of advancing across waterlogged terrain. Some units reported men and vehicles lost to unexpected currents, while others were delayed for days, unable to find safe crossing points. Though the Wehrmacht pressed forward relentlessly, the flood created pockets of reprieve, moments when the soldiers on the defensive could regroup, reinforce, and plan their next moves. It was a strange inversion. The very landscape itself had become an ally, at least temporarily, in the struggle to survive. Within the flooded villages, civilians emerged cautiously, watching the soldiers with a mixture of fear and awe. Women and children helped wherever possible, passing sandbags, guiding livestock, or carrying water for the men. Their contributions were unsung but essential, part of a silent network of resistance against both the flood and the invading forces. Soldiers later wrote of these civilians with a reverence born of witnessing courage under conditions that would have broken many professional armies. Every life saved was a testament to coordination, human endurance, and improvisation, an affirmation that even in war, ordinary people could perform extraordinary acts. Technical ingenuity became as important as physical strength. Engineers built temporary sluices to redirect water, sometimes at risk of undermining their own position. Makeshift rafts transported supplies across newly formed lakes. Trenches were dug deeper, reinforced with wooden beams and sandbags to withstand surging currents. Each innovation was tested under fire, sometimes literally, as shells and bullets rained from the enemy, and often failure meant immediate disaster. Pilot memoirs from nearby airfields note that reconnaissance flights over these areas frequently reported soldiers battling the water more than the enemy, highlighting the unusual and perilous nature of this front. Yet for all their efforts, the floodwaters were merciless. There were nights when levees cracked unexpectedly, sweeping away tents, ammunition, and tragically men. The cold penetrated to the bone, and disease followed closely behind the water. Hypothermia, trench foot, and infections claimed as many lives as bullets. But the soldiers pressed on, driven by duty, fear, and an almost instinctive will to survive. Each day became a cycle of vigilance: dig, reinforce, watch, pray, and repeat. The flood tested not only physical endurance but psychological limits. Diaries from this period reveal recurring themes: fear, desperation, camaraderie, and moments of almost transcendental clarity, when men realized the stakes of their fight were greater than any battle plan. Interestingly, the flood also created temporary tactical advantages. Roads rendered impassable to enemy vehicles meant supply lines were stretched and coordination faltered, natural channels diverted troops away from fortified positions, inadvertently concentrating them in areas easier to monitor and control. Soldiers adapted, using the water itself as a defensive tool, a barrier that, while unpredictable, bought time. In hindsight, some historians describe this as a rare instance where nature's chaos inadvertently supported military strategy. Yet it remained clear, without the unyielding labor of human hands, the advantage would have been fleeting, and the flood could have spelled utter disaster. By the end of this long day, exhaustion weighed heavily on all. Mud-caked faces, blistered hands, and soaked uniforms testified to the physical cost of survival. Yet there were victories too. Trenches remained intact, villages avoided total destruction, and civilians had been rescued from rising waters. The soldiers understood, with a mixture of relief and apprehension, that the battle was not yet over. The enemy had not been defeated, the flood was far from control, and tomorrow would demand the same grit, ingenuity, and courage. But in that fleeting moment of dawn, there was recognition that human determination, ingenuity, and unyielding spirit could hold back even forces seemingly impossible to resist. As night approached once more, the river roared in the distance, and soldiers prepared to face another relentless cycle of effort, danger, and endurance. They had survived a day that many had deemed impossible, and in the quiet, damp trenches and soaked embankments, a new resolve was born. Survival, against all odds, was a fight worth every drop of blood and sweat. The night was unusually silent, save for the distant roar of the river. Soldiers huddled along the embankments, their faces streaked with mud, sweat, and the grime of relentless effort. Each man knew what the morning could bring. Either the fragile levees would hold, or the floodwaters would claim everything in their path. The enemy was still pressing, cautious but relentless, aware that the swollen rivers and disrupted roads could no longer be ignored. Somewhere upstream, the river surged with renewed fury, as if it sensed the exhaustion of those who dared oppose it. Commanders moved among the men, issuing terse orders, inspecting sandbag walls, checking ropes and beams. Their voices were calm, almost eerily so, but the tension was unmistakable. Each soldier understood the stakes. One misstep, one failure of coordination, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Memoirs written decades later describe this night as the most surreal experience of the front. We were fighting the enemy, yes, but more often it felt as though we were battling the river itself. The flood had become both adversary and test, revealing courage, fear, and resolve in equal measure. By midnight, the water had risen again, lapping hungrily at the hastily reinforced embankments. Engineers, exhausted beyond measure, inspected the weakest points. Shouts carried across the wind as men adjusted planks, patched sandbags, and braced each other against the icy current. A sudden collapse of part of the dike sent men scrambling, clutching whatever they could to stay upright. The roar of the river drowned out all but the closest voices. In those moments, individual heroism mattered most. A soldier grabbed a child, swept toward the water. Another risked his life to secure a splintering sandbag wall. Small acts became monumental in scale, and the survival of hundreds depended on them. Civilians, who had fled to higher ground, watched from a distance. Some prayed, some wept, others offered silent encouragement. Women carried water to exhausted men, fed the injured, and assisted wherever possible. Even in the chaos, human bonds formed, a network of survival that transcended rank, experience, and fear. The soldiers realized that their fight was not just against water or enemy, but for the very lives of those who had no weapons, no training, only trust in the men who defended them. The enemy, meanwhile, had begun probing the weakened areas, testing for crossings. German reconnaissance reported men wading into the cold, guiding others, reinforcing levees and deflecting debris, a scene unfamiliar and bewildering to professional soldiers trained only for conventional combat. Artillery was limited by mud and waterlogged roads, and attacks that would normally have been devastating were slowed, diverted, or blunted by the natural barrier the river had become. The flood, unpredictable as it was, had brought precious hours, perhaps even days, of strategic delay, yet no one allowed themselves to believe the danger was over. As dawn approached, the climax of the struggle arrived. A section of the main levee, weakened by hours of pounding water, threatened to breach. Men rushed forward, shovels in hand, sandbags clutched to chests, shouting encouragement and instruction. Hypothermia and fatigue had already claimed some. Others pushed through exhaustion with a single-minded determination. Every decision was immediate and irreversible. Engineers shouted calculations, soldiers passed sandbags in a human chain, and civilians lent hands wherever they could. The river hit the levee with relentless force, and the embankment shuddered dangerously under the impact. Then, in a moment frozen in collective memory, the soldiers held. Planks and sandbags, human muscle, and sheer willpower kept the water at bay. The levee creaked but did not break. Cheers were stifled by mud-caked faces and disbelief. Soldiers collapsed into each other's arms, not in celebration, but in exhausted relief. Every man knew the cost. Some friends were gone, swept away or claimed by the cold. Others were injured, trembling, or half-frozen. Yet the line held, and for the first time in days, it seemed that survival might be possible. The flood receded slowly over the next hours, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Villages had been spared total destruction, roads remained partially passable, and civilians began to emerge from hiding. The men surveyed the devastation, fields turned into lakes, homes partially submerged, and trees bent and broken like discarded matchsticks. It was a stark reminder that victory in such conditions was measured not by glory but by endurance and resilience. Every sandbag, every shouted order, every human chain had contributed to survival in the face of overwhelming odds. Soldiers later recounted these hours in diaries and letters. One wrote, "We fought the river as fiercely as any enemy, and it was only by every hand, every effort that lives were saved." Another described the psychological toll. "We were both terrified and focused. The water demanded our respect, and it was unforgiving. But in fighting it, we learned what we were capable of." These reflections highlight a critical truth. The flood was not merely a natural event, but a crucible that tested courage, leadership, and the limits of human endurance. By nightfall, the men gathered in small groups, some tending to the injured, others writing letters, some simply staring at the darkened river, with an unspoken understanding. The enemy had not been destroyed, and the river remained a potential threat, but the human spirit had proven resilient. The soldiers had survived a challenge deemed impossible. They had faced nature and the enemy, often simultaneously, and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. In the weeks that followed, the story of these men spread quietly. Pilots, engineers, infantrymen, and civilians alike carried the memory of a night when human determination had turned the tide, literally, against disaster. They were ordinary men performing extraordinary acts, bound together by circumstance, fear, and courage. Modern historians would later describe these events as a testament to improvisation, resilience, and the remarkable ability of human beings to respond under extreme pressure. The river, calm once more, reflected the dawn light as if acknowledging the effort that had kept its waters at bay. Soldiers returned to trenches, engineers to construction, and civilians to rebuild, all carrying the knowledge that survival had been earned, not granted. It was a quiet triumph, unheralded in the annals of grand battles, yet monumental in human terms. The line had held, lives had been spared, and hope, fragile but real, endured. And in that enduring memory, there lies a lesson that resonates beyond war. Courage is measured not only in acts of aggression, but in resistance, perseverance, and the refusal to surrender when every circumstance demands it. The soldiers who faced the flood understood this intuitively. Against impossible odds, amid water, mud, and fear, they held fast, they survived. And in surviving, they became living proof of the indomitable strength of the human spirit.